I was born in the northeast of England in a town called Newcastle, and I went up to Oxford as a student, and I studied philosophy and politics and economics at Oxford, and then I got more and more interested in sociology, which was not really in existence much in Oxford then. Political theory is what I mainly did, and I was kind of interested in the old, in Marxism, and in particular, for some reason, in late 19th century French Marxism. So thinkers like Georges Sorel. And my supervisor, as I was a graduate student, I remember having a telephone conversation with him and saying, well, I think I might like to do something on Sorel. And he said to me, have you ever read any Durkheim? And I hadn't really, I didn't know. So I went and read The Division of Labour, and I thought, well, yes, it's interesting, but a little bit antique. And then I thought, well, I'll read The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. And to use an American colloquialism, this blew my mind. I just thought this was an astonishing book. Sometimes I hear colleagues talking about theory as though it's like a separate activity, and then there's something else called research or the world. And I never like to think that way. It seems to me we think theoretically when we're actually reflecting and developing concepts and trying to understand how the world works. And so in this sense, theory is inescapable, except that sometimes people don't attend to it very much. As Keynes said somewhere, we're in the grip of theories from the past, and sometimes we don't know it. So I suppose I'm trying to answer your question. I think to be interested in theory is just to be reflective, isn't it? You can theorize and spin theories to your heart's content, but you actually got to make them explain something. Actually, it's quite interesting. Going back to Durkheim, I quote this in my book. Durkheim once said to a doctoral student whose dissertation rather irritated him. Durkheim must have been a very frightening person, I think. And he said to this doctoral student, to philosophize is to think what one wants. There's something that the English word scientism refers to, which is something like making a fetish of science. And I don't like that very much. I remember that Wright Mills, in his book on the sociological imagination, feels in that first chapter uncomfortable about the very phrase social science. And that's got something to do with just a sense that, proclaiming the scientific status of sociology can be pretentious and can lead people to make claims that are not justified about what the extent to which it's possible to predict and control the social world. I actually think, on the other hand, if pressed, and you didn't ask me this question, but if you said to me, are you an empiricist? I would say yes.
In what sense?
In the sense that I just think we always have to look for the evidence of whatever it is we're claiming. And sometimes that can be far more difficult than people who like to call themselves social scientists suppose. Okay. There is a kind of pathology, I think, wouldn't you agree? Among very much alive still, of people who think you can really only study scientifically what you can measure. Mm-hmm. And behind that, more generally, there's another kind of illusion, which also is a kind of pathology, I think, that we can only seriously study scientifically what we can see, what we can observe, like behavior, for instance. And that also seems to me to be a kind of illusion, because sometimes, as Durkheim well knew, you have to look for indirect evidence. You have to look for what he used to call an index of something that is itself intangible, even unobservable. The example I like to give of this is power. When I got involved in the debate about power, and I wrote my book, which was published in 1974, I was contributing to a debate which had existed in American political science above all. And the original idea, the first idea was, well, you can only really study people exercising power over other people by prevailing over them in decision-making situations which you could observe their behavior. I win, you lose. So that's power. And then second step was that two thinkers, Bacharach and Baratz, they were called, Peter Bacharach, who was a friend of mine, and Morton Baratz, wrote a famous article called Two Faces of Power, in which they basically said, look, that's too simple. That's just too one-dimensional. There's a second face of power in which we have to look at who is deciding upon what gets decided. In other words, how is the agenda controlled? And their idea was we can only really do that. We have to do that. We have to look at the control of agenda by figuring out who is actually at work in suppressing grievances, or at least preventing grievances from reaching the political agenda. Like, for example, if you've got a decision-making body like a city council or a government legislature, let's say, certain issues just don't reach the decision-making stage because the agenda's been fixed, because various grievances have been kept out of the out of the area of discussion. But then they went on to say a really interesting thing which provoked me. They said, well, suppose we can't see the grievances. Suppose we can't find people who are complaining, who have a kind of, who are expressing desires and demands which are not reaching the political stage, the political decision-making arena. If we can't see those grievances at work, as it were, in a community or in a society, then there's nothing we can say as social scientists. And then they make this, and then they have this wonderful sentence: we have to leave that problem to the philosopher. And I thought, that just has to be wrong. That is to say, if grievances are not observable, that could be because power is even more deeply at work. That's to say, people are adapting their preferences, or have beliefs, or are in one or another way have been power has been at work in shaping their beliefs and desires in such a way that they don't have grievances which they otherwise would. That led me into a lot of trouble, but I claim that happens. Marxists call it false consciousness. I don't like that phrase very much, but what I think is true, I call it third dimension of power. And that is where you can, you have to realize that there's something to be studied, and that power, if power, as I think, can be at its most effective when it's least observable, least perceptible, least observable to both actors and observers, it's still there, but you just have to look for indirect evidence.
I do think that, there are certainly different points of view. And for example, in the moral philosophy, I think that a philosophical approach to normative questions is really preoccupied with questions of justification. Okay. So what am I justified to think, in a way, is a philosophically oriented question. Whereas a sociologist is interested in what do people believe that they're justified to think. In other words, what are the prevailing justifications in a given social context or group or society? And those are different issues. You could say that's a distinction between a first-person philosophical question is a first-person question. Okay. Question asked by someone, by the first person, or addressed to the person who's having to make the judgment. In other words, what justifies you, or how am I justified in believing something or other, or what would justify me to believe this or that? Whereas the philosopher, the sociologist, is doing a comparative study of forms of justification, styles of justification, bases of justification, in which the questions are empirical.
If you're going to think about morals and morality sociologically, you have to take serious note of what the biologists are telling us. You can be skeptical about, for example, the just so stories that evolutionary biologists tell us about how, the humans evolved from the earliest hunter-gatherer, societies and all of this. But however, a lot of that is very interesting and important to think about. Frans de Waal you mentioned. I think Frans de Waal is a animal. Is he an animal psychologist, really? Wouldn't you say?
Yes, primatologist.
Yeah. Primatologist, yes, with a mission. He's a missionary in a way. I'm not in a position to judge him as a primatologist. The science of primatology is not my specialism, but I do know. Primatologists or scientists who, for example, have a very high opinion of his first book on chimpanzee politics, which is full of very interesting material. He then got into the mode of writing about morality and wrote this book called Good Natured. The mission of which is to suggest that we have seriously underestimated the extent to which animals represent goodness and the good nature. This kind of Cartesian idea of the brutes as opposed to us noble human beings is a mistake. I'm sure he's right about that, but then I think he goes much further than that. He's trying always to prove that animals have morality and are altruistic, but more than that they maybe have a sense of fairness, all these kinds of things. And there, I think there's much more scope for controversy and doubt. One thing I find very interesting about him, and this comes out in the book on primates and philosophers, is when he suggests that anthropomorphism may not just be a prejudice or even a mistake. It might be a good research strategy. I think that's a stimulating and interesting idea.
This essay that you're very interested in,
Yes.
Me Too,
Yes.
Individualism and the Intellectuals. It wasn't about torture, but it was about human rights or civil rights. It was about the question of whether Dreyfus should be given a fair trial, because it was clear that it became increasingly clear that Dreyfus was not guilty and was being framed, and the argument that the anti-Dreyfusards were making was, don't question this trial, don't question this judgment of the military and of the church, because it threatens social cohesion. It threatens the solidarity. As we'd say in America today, national security issue. And what Durkheim did in this wonderful essay, Individuals and Intellectuals, was he said, look, this is sociologically a mistake, because what serves to maintain the solidarity of a modern, ever more heterogeneous modern industrial society is the valuation, the high valuation of the rights of individuals. And if you start chipping away at the right to a fair trial, you do something dangerous to what holds the society together. A kind of moral unraveling can occur. And I think something like that, and I once wrote an article to argue this, is true of torture. That's to say, if you relax taboo on torture, that has all kinds of consequences, can have all kinds of consequences. It means that the bases of respect for persons enshrined in the law gets weakened. Not, of course, that doesn't mean that people are disrespected in all kinds of ways all the time. We live in a racist world, for instance, of course. But if you start the law starts to say, or the official authorities of society start to say, well, torture is okay under certain circumstances. That has social consequences. So that's an argument of a sociological kind about the dangers of you asked me about torture. That's a sociological kind of argument against relaxing the taboo against torture.
So I remember when I went to Brazil at that time, in the 1970s, there was this phenomenon of self-censorship, where in an authoritarian setting, people restrain themselves from saying what they would otherwise say. But then it gets even more interesting when you're in a culture like, because you asked me about the contemporary world, so Russia, where I just, as it happens, just been to a meeting just now, it's today, about what's going on in Russia, Putin's Russia. So what do we think about Russia, where there's been this huge revival of religion in an Orthodox Christianity, and this massive campaign, which turns out to be very successful against LGBT, lesbians, gays, and so on. What is going on? And you know, maybe one could say, oh well, this is just the way Russians think. This is some kind of cultural norm. Or you could say, which it seems to me much more plausible, is that there have been some extremely effective campaigns which have been initiated and sustained by not just the regime, the political leaders, but also the church, to use this kind of thinking as a way of asserting and reinforcing a sense of national identity and hostility to the West and traditional values. All of that, it seems to me, must have something to do with power. That, I think, is a threat to human rights, yes. I remember that, you probably recall that, you won't remember it in your biography, but in 1947, the American Anthropological Association leadership under Melville Herskovits tried to get the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which was declared in 1948, there was an attempt to get it to proclaim the principle that each culture has the right to pursue its own values in its own way, something like that. And that is definitely a threat to human rights, isn't it? Because what about cultures that violate human rights?
Yes.
I mean, the idea that what counts as freedom is whatever, and what counts as a human right is whatever any given culture thinks is human right, is obviously going to. So, where if you have cultures that are seriously oppressive of women, for instance, what are we going to say? That that's just a local cultural practice and should be preserved?
This is one argument. There are people who endorse this kind of argument, and they have good reasons to do so.
Well, they have reasons, but they
Yes.
don't have good reasons.
It's true. But yes.
I mean, but then we come back to this issue that I was raising before about the differences between custom and morality. I mean, there are plainly ways in which, I mean, there are different ways of respecting women, for instance. And they don't all involve the same practices. But I would think we could all agree that wife beating is not a way of respecting women. What's involved here very often is language. I mean, suppose you call wife beating disciplining.
Yes.
Then you can, and just to be very specific, this kind of debate goes on in villages.
Yes.
In countries where human rights workers are actively engaged in the business of trying to get local, let's say village courts or whatever, to accept that this practice is a violation of what, you know, in New York or wherever the UN, some UN declaration is declared to be a violation of human rights. But the anthropologist Sally Merry is very interesting on this, because she talks about this problem of what she calls vernacularization. In other words, how do you translate into the vernacular, that's to say the local language, this idea of human rights, where some local patriarch in a family is disciplining his wife and hasn't a clue what you're talking about. I mean, I continue to try to think about that. I mean, people wrestle with this and still go on. It used to be the case, maybe it's less true now, that undergraduates would come to seminars with a very simplified relativist view, which could be basically summed up in the question, who are we to judge? Who are we to judge other people? Who are we to judge other peoples, other cultures, and so on? But this is, I mean, philosophers argue about this often in a very abstract and technical way. Anthropologists, I think, there's a kind of temptation among anthropologists to be relativists, because there used to be anyway. It's kind of built into the very discipline of social anthropology that cultures differ, and somehow the idea who we to judge, that question is kind of almost a kind of instinctive response among many anthropologists. Not all, by any means. But I increasingly, as I was saying to you before, I actually find the problem a fascinating one, because if a distinction is to be drawn between what we could call mores, or the French call mœurs, there isn't exactly an English word for it, something like customs and manners and etiquette, all those things. Of course, we're completely relativist about those things. Let's just say how people greet each other, how they dress, what they, modes of behavior that are customary are not subject to criticism from outside. And yet, other things are. I mean, torture, we were talking about before, rape of women, female circumcision. These are moral questions, we all think. And so where does this line to be drawn? Vegetarianism used to be definitely a customary matter. Some people ate animals, other people didn't. Why has that become a moral question? And to ask a deeper question, is this very distinction between what's moral and what's customary itself just a customary distinction? There are plenty of people who, when talking about relativism, just think, oh, relativism's obviously a ridiculous position.
But it's not.
That in other words, anyone who's a relativist can be dismissed just by using this label. And I think, yes, I resist that, because I actually think these are really interesting and difficult questions in which nobody should really sort of venture to talk about them unless they've really felt the strong pull of a relativist point of view.